Yeah, I've often said, if you told 10-year-old or 12-year-old or 15-year-old me what I would be doing now, man, my mind would have been blown. Like I had no idea that that would be something that would happen.
He is the public address announcer for the Chicago Bears, Chicago Fire FC, Illinois Fighting Illini, and the Chicago Bulls. We have the pleasure in welcoming Tim Sinclair onto Hoopsology. How's it going, Tim?
Going great. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Nice to meet you guys.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for coming on to the show. We've been interviewing public address announcers, I would say, for the past year or so throughout the league. So it's just fantastic always to get your guys' perspective on the game. And one of the traditions we have just on our show is just to get some of our guests either first basketball memory or favorite basketball memory, just from your childhood or just throughout your life, just anywhere you want to take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably favorite overall was my dad and I shooting hoops in the driveway. I grew up in Detroit, so at the time it was getting to the Bad Boy Pistons era. I'm pretty old, and so he would do. George Blaha has been a longtime broadcaster for the Pistons, still is, I think, although he's had some health issues recently. But my dad would do his calls in the driveway as we were shooting them. He'd be like, "High glass are good," and we would do just all the stuff George would do. And so, if I think about an overall memory, that's probably it. If you're looking for a game, 85 or 86, I saw Jordan play in the Pontiac Silverdome
Wow.
against the Pistons and drop 60 in a game. So
Nice.
that would probably have to be, at least from my childhood, number one.
So for Matt and we only watch Jordan on television. We have such a high regard, I guess, especially for myself, as being a longtime Bulls fan. But you actually saw Jordan, in that moment from your childhood. I mean, that's very rare just to see that moment in time. Like, what is that like? From seeing that moment from your childhood, just compared to now, just becoming the announcer, just the PA announcer for the Chicago Bulls, like, can you reconcile those two moments in time? Like, can you make that comparison? Like that has to be very crazy for you.
Yeah, I've often said, if you told 10-year-old or 12-year-old or 15-year-old me what I would be doing now, man, my mind would have been blown. Like I had no idea that that would be something that would happen. Certainly loved. I saw Jordan play in person twice. Once near the beginning of his career, once right near the end. I think it was the year after the United Center opened. And so those were my two experiences. And to me, I was just gonna take them, and I thought those would kind of be the preeminent memories of NBA basketball for my lifetime, not having any idea that, a few years later I'd be sitting courtside doing it every single day. So it is hard to wrap my brain around sometimes because it's just absolutely incredible. I don't take it for granted. And I wish kind of now that I had been able to look at the game a little differently when I was a kid so I could compare and contrast a little bit better. But as a kid, you're just like in awe of everything. And, you don't necessarily remember points and rebounds and strategy and all that kind of stuff. You just remember the spectacle of it all. And so I try to go into games with a little bit of that childlike mindset even now. But obviously, the job dictates otherwise most days.
Well, interestingly enough, we had a guest on our show last month who was there in person for Jordan's 63 against the Celtics. What was it like just in that game? I mean, you mentioned, being a child for that game. I mean, was there a lot of vitriol towards Jordan? Did he kind of win the room over by dropping 60 on the team, or what was that
Well,
like?
first of all, it was in the Pontiac Silverdome, which was like a giant football dome. It was where the Lions played. And so there was a basketball court, and we were a long way away. I think, Detroit fans are fairly notorious for being loud and obnoxious and cheering against you. But at a certain point, I was probably 6 or 7 years old. People kind of knew they were seeing some history in the making, and so at a certain point you just got to tip your hat to a guy who's on fire and taken over and appreciate what you've watched even though your team is losing. And as best I remember, most people were kind of in that frame of mind, but obviously, fans are fans and they're called fanatics for a reason. And so I'm sure they were doing their fair share of yelling. But, you know, if you could point to the scoreboard and show that you've got 60, it's hard for anybody to say too much.
So, Tim, let's transition and let's get into how you became a public address announcer. We've interviewed other PA announcers throughout the league, and their journeys are so different. So, what was kind of put you on this path?
Well, I thought I was going to be an architect. That's what I went to college to do. And a couple semesters in, I realized I needed a part-time job to make a little money and make ends meet while I was going to architecture school. And so I reached out to a friend. He was more of a friend of my parents, but he worked at a local radio station. I thought, hey, maybe he has some part-time work that I can do. And so I asked him, hey, you know, any chance I could work a few hours a week for you? And he said, do you want to be on the air? And I went, sure. Okay. Why not? And so he put me on the air after a little bit of training, and I was terrible, but I loved it. And I realized quickly that even though I was pretty good at architecture, I was passionate about radio. And that's really what sent me on the path for communication. It was many years later, though, that I eventually got into public address. I've been doing radio for a decade or more, loved sports, and some openings came up at the University of Illinois. And someone said, hey, you should apply for that. And so I went, okay, why not? And I applied, and they, like a year later, got me a baseball game to do. And again, I was terrible, but loved it. And, little by little, got one thing after another, and another opportunity here, and another one here. And eventually I realized, hey, maybe I could turn this into a career.
It
One,
seems like so different and varied. Did you have to do like an audition in order
yeah, good
to
question.
start doing games? How did that work?
Yeah, for Illinois, I was a radio personality in the area, so they knew I could at least string one word in front of the next. And I did send in a resume and a made up reel of work, primarily from radio, to show that I was capable. And baseball to me is, other than maybe soccer, is the easiest of all the sports to do, because it's literally just now batting, the number, the name of the player. That's it. I mean,
Mm.
maybe a substitute, if they're going to swap out your pitcher or something like that, a pitching change, you'll announce that. But otherwise, there's very little to do. So that was kind of ground floor of where I got to start. And I think that was probably good that it wasn't too high paced, and because that can be overwhelming in a hurry. If you get dropped into a basketball or a football game, that would be, trial by fire. But every other job after that has been audition based, where they have an opening. Either I hear about it, or someone says, hey, you should apply for this, or a team reaches out to me, and it requires, sending in a resume, sending in my demo reel, going through an audition process of some sort, usually, a meeting online, then a meeting in person, then an audition in the arena. And, you take what you get.
So, what is your, I guess, strategy or roadmap in terms of how do you announce, different teams? I know just talking to there's other announcers that, some of them have an understated style, some of them are more flamboyant. So, kind of what's your philosophy, especially just when announcing the home team and then the opposing team as well?
I always say I'm a fan with a microphone. So, in a lot of ways, I get to cheer on the team like fans do, although with some rules and restrictions thrown in. And my goal is always to reflect what the crowd is or should be feeling in a certain moment. So I kind of read the room and let that dictate my excitement, my energy level, how high I go, how low I get. A 3-pointer in the first quarter is exciting, but it's not the same as a buzzer beater. Um, and it's not the same as when you're down 30. So, I've never been a guy who's always turned up to 11, or trying to pretend that things are more exciting than they are. I know some have different feelings and strategies on that, but for me, that comes across as incredibly inauthentic. I'm not just a robotic voice. I'm a human. I'm a fan, and my goal is always to try to reflect what the game says I should be reflecting. And Sometimes that's hard to do if people aren't super happy with what's happening at the moment. But I do think it's the most authentic. I do think it sort of gives me I don't know the best way to say it, but I don't want anybody ever to feel like I'm faking it, because I don't ever want to fake it. And so that's really my strategy. I do get super excited when the moment calls for it. I do, a visitor is very matter of fact. I don't try to demean anybody or dismiss. I'm not a dismissive guy, but I'm also not excited if LeBron scores. So that's really my goal. So far, it's worked really, really well, and I'm incredibly thankful for the reception I've got in all of the opportunities I've had to work.
And speaking of all those opportunities, I mean, you mentioned, baseball being kind of a slower pace naturally by the game, and easier responsibilities potentially there. Um, Compare and contrast that for us, if you would, between like something like soccer, that's continuous, and of course basketball, pretty continuous there as well. What are the different challenges with like the size of the field of play or court, along with the pace of play?
Yeah, the three I do most often are soccer, basketball, and football. And so soccer, there's a lot of stuff pregame and there's a lot of stuff halftime. And then during the game, there's not much to do, quite honestly.
Mm-hmm.
We only talk as public address people during uh, either goals, substitutions, or red and yellow cards, which in some games are very few and far between, since substitutions are limited, and
True.
often goals are limited as well. So soccer is probably the easiest in that, all of a sudden late in the second half, you might have three or four substitutions all at the same time. And so you go from doing nothing for half an hour to a whole lot over the course of the next 2 minutes. But to me, that's the simplest. It's enjoyable for a variety of reasons, but in terms of the mechanics of it, it's
Hmm.
fairly simple. Basketball is fairly nonstop. It's up and down the court. You're announcing not only who made a basket, but fouls on the individual and on the team, who's at the line shooting free throws. If the referees have a review, you're trying to read their lips and figure out, okay, how do I take what just happened in New York and relate it to, all right, our fans need to know X, Y, or Z. And then football to me is the hardest.
Hmm.
In basketball, you're up very close. There's only 10 people on the court. None of them are wearing helmets, so you can see easily who they are. In football, though, you're farther removed from the field. There's 22 people out there who are running on and off constantly, and they're all wearing helmets, so you can't. It's like facial recognition isn't a thing, and you're talking all the time. It's not just if something happens, you talk when something doesn't happen. If there's an incompletion, you say, incomplete pass intended for number 11, Darnell Mooney, 2nd and 10 for the Bears at their own 22, or whatever. So it's a constant flow of words and trying to figure out who's doing what, to do it before the play clock gets to a certain level, because you can't talk past that in the NFL. So I hope that answers your question, but
Yeah.
those are kind of the hierarchies of difficulty when it comes to doing a sport, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, it's funny because I guess I would assume with the more continuous flow of basketball that it might be the more difficult, but realizing in what you said, there's actually probably a greater level of detail in terms of having to note where the placement of the ball is and things like that between every play with football. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
very
4 hours
interesting.
of nonstop thinking, and I've got a spotter in football, which helps. I handle the offense, so I pay attention to who the ball was handed to, who the quarterback is, who the wideouts and tight end is. My spotter's looking at the defensive side, so by the time I get the offensive side said, he's given me a number as to who made the tackle, and then he's saying, okay, that from the 17 to the 21. So now in my head, I'm like, all right, 4 yard gain on the play, 2nd and 6 for the Bears at their own 21 yard line. And that's happening 120 times a game in 20-second increments. So yeah, it is a constant thing. It's basketball and gameplay is a little bit more continuous, but in terms of my role, football feels more that way.
Have you had any players or coaches make suggestions or just make comments about just your style in terms of how you just announce just different players and maybe either the opposing or the home team? Do you have any type of stories regarding those interactions?
I haven't had too many people tell me what they want me to do. I'm assuming that's good news. Typically, if you've rubbed somebody the wrong way, especially if they're your home team, they will tell you very quickly, "We don't want that every time." But I've never had that happen, so I consider that a good thing. I mean, the big thing is pronunciations to make sure that you're getting those correct, and there are sheets and websites and phonetic pronunciations and people you can go to double check. And so, if there's ever a question, I always try to make sure I've found the PR person for a pro team or the sports information director for a college team to go double check and make sure I know, because everybody deserves to have the name pronounced how they want it to be. Um, so occasionally, one will be mistyped or the phonetics aren't quite right, and so I'll say it what it looks like it should be, and they'll come over and say, "Hey, it's actually this," or I'll misread something. So that happens every once in a while, but thankfully, my goal is to get it right the first time every time, and so far that's worked.
Wanted to ask also about your experience with NBA India, just announcing up there. What were those games like? What was that environment like?
Yeah, I had been in the NBA for less than a year when
Wow,
the Pacers traveled to India and asked if I wanted to go with them, and I was like, "Of course." Uh,
cool.
we flew on the team plane, so they had a charter that we took, and it was the Pacers and their coaching staffs and Larry Bird and me. And we went over, and it was a great time. Now, we weren't there very long, so the jet lag was pretty severe,
Mm,
but to get to play in a country where they'd never had an NBA game was something pretty special. They converted an arena that was not used for basketball. It was just sort of a gathering place. They converted this into a basketball arena. They were literally still letting the concrete dry around the outside of some things they had done when we showed up. They just got it done just in time.
wow.
But not only was it a cool experience, but it's where I met the guys who are in charge of the NBA production. And that's ultimately what got me now two All-Star games, led me to be able to go to the bubble, because my time there, I was able to at least impress the people who mattered and get some pretty cool invitations as a result.
And I know, of course, I mean, everyone knows the NBA has been doing a really good job expanding the sport. At the time you guys were there, what did you feel the interest level was in that community? Did you have a sense of, people were really interested in going to check out these pro teams playing? What was that vibe kind of like?
Both were sellouts. Now, in a city that big with an arena that's fairly small, you would expect that. But everywhere we went, there were billboards and signs and things saying, NBA India, and given the dates of the games. And so it sure felt like everybody was very excited about it. And, there was a lot of excitement in the arena at those games. One was kind of more for dignitaries and special guests. And so that was
Mm.
a little bit more subdued, but not much. The other one was reserved for school children, and they brought kids from schools all over Mumbai, and that was incredibly loud. If you've ever been to one of those like field trip days at women's basketball
Yeah.
college, it was like that, where they
Nice.
just screamed from beginning to end, but it was fantastic.
Tim, we can't let you go without just getting your just opinions of this announcing those all-star games. What was that environment like? That's such a, I think, I don't know, I might be in the minority of thinking about this, but I would argue that it's the most premier day on the NBA calendar is the all-star game. Such a glamour event. All the legends are there, all the pop and circumstances. What was that environment like?
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I call it the Super Bowl of the NBA.
Yeah.
It's but to me, it's an even bigger production because the Super Bowl is one day, whereas All Star Weekend is three and a half. There are so many, between the celebrity game and the rising stars and the dunk contest, like all that's it's just unbelievable how many people it takes to pull something like that off and how much rehearsal it takes. The first one I ever did was in Chicago, and that was before I was hired by the Bulls. I was still with the Pacers at the time, but they brought me into Chicago to do both Saturday night and the game on Sunday. That was 3 weeks after Kobe died. And so there was all sorts of obviously extra things put in place as a result of that, which made it was obviously sad, but from a logistic standpoint, made it more difficult to pull off. And then this last year in Cleveland was the NBA 75th. And so, I got to narrate basically the entire halftime of all these legends walking onto the stage one by one. And man, I was just as in awe of as everybody else was. I just had to concentrate maybe a little bit more than they did, and couldn't enjoy it quite as much because I was so in the thick of it. But I think that's one of those days that I don't know how you recreate ever. Maybe at the NBA 100th they do something similar, and I hope to be the voice of that too if they still allow me to be. But it was absolutely incredible. The NBA knows how to do those things right, and being a part of it, small part of it, has been the honor of a lifetime, and I'm very appreciative.